I'm Quenita Walrond Lewis, Director of the National Center for Educational Resource Development, NCERD. So the renewed curriculum is almost like a re-engineering of how we wish to see education progressed or transmuted from teacher to learner. The renewed curriculum is, for the first time in almost 3 decades, a holistic overhaul of the teaching and learning process in terms of being a guide of the kinds of content that children should learn that is developmentally appropriate for them, that is interesting for them, and also delivered in a way that sustains understanding, that promotes curiosity, that develops a sense of inquiry, and that allows them to experience their teaching and, experience learning in a way that is deep, meaningful, and that can sustain that desire to learn throughout their lifetime. Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. Now, our previous curriculum had, I guess fortunately or unfortunately, I say fortunately because at the particular times or the points in history or points in time, had additions that sought to be topical at that time. But when you span 30 years and you think about how much things have changed or shifted in education, in development, in what we know to be facts about the world. You know, Pluto was a planet, then it wasn't, then it is again. These things require general shifting and retooling every so often. In fact, most curricula exist along a 5 to 10 year cycle, and then they need to be re-examined. So what you would find would be new or different would be some content, the organization of that content, because what we found was that the old curriculum in different disciplines would either have been too full or too content heavy in ways that were not serving children. And I say that to say that it wasn't developmentally appropriate. So you would have, for example, in grade 6, a learner learning the eye to the level of detail that a second-year medical student might have been. Or you might find topics that would be inappropriate for a learner who is still at their pre-operational or concrete operational stage of development, meaning that they only really fully understand or interact with things that are directly in front of them, that they can touch, manipulate, and feel and turn. And they're being asked to master concepts that require them to become more abstract thinkers, which is something that happens at a later developmental stage. So they're being asked to imagine or wonder about rotations of three-dimensional figures from 2D shapes and things like that, instead of moving from concrete things or interacting with concrete objects. Just using that as a working example to show that the renewed curriculum takes all of those things into consideration, and it also is a lot more culturally responsive and representative of what it is to be Guyanese. One of the fundamental goals upon which this curriculum rests is that every child in Guyana should find themselves in this curriculum. And that goes to the examples that are expressed there for teachers to use, the stories that you would find therein. You find representation of our indigenous cultures, well represented there. And this is, I think, a really beautiful addition, because now we are not just taking something that was wrought for the industrial age. It is now embracing the technological era that we're in. So you'll see a lot of the resources or a lot of the examples and strategies draw on experiences that our children now find indigenous to themselves. And we also try to provide teacher level supports within the curriculum document as well, which is something that is a nice new feature. So there's lots to find from every aspect of development, whether it's sociocultural, whether it's cognitive, whether it's methodology for teachers, and they all rest on a very sound pedagogical foundation of researched best practice. So the curriculum is directly aligned to international standards of practice with our own culturally responsive flair. This entire process began when we thought about curriculum renewal. And I say renewal as opposed to reform. A lot of people say, curriculum reform. That's usually the parlance that is used. But we go for curriculum renewal because renewal recognizes that there was a good in a thing. And our previous curriculum did have a lot of good elements. So we did not want to dismiss that, or as we would say, throw the baby away with the bathwater. However, we did go across this entire country, every single education district, and we tried to hear from everyone, our different stakeholder groups, whether it would be our disability organizations, whether it is the top of the country to the bottom. We went to all of our hinterland communities, or we tried to get very sound representation from different private sector groups, teachers, head teachers, any community member. We wanted to hear from our citizens. What is it they wanted out of their education system? And that feedback provided the impetus for the framework on which this entire curriculum process stands. So I feel good, and I can say it with much confidence, that this is Guyana's curriculum. And it's a thing of beauty when you recognize that an offering created before we started hearing about One Guyana is based on exactly those principles. So it's a work that I think that all of Guyana should get behind and that we should all be proud of. The biggest one that jumps out at me is the idea that children learn best by doing, by experiencing their world. And this is, I guess if I were to put it in colloquial parlance, chalk and talk is dead in this renewed curriculum. It is no longer a teacher standing up there and talking at children. It's children working together. It's the teacher and children working together. Children have opportunities to work by themselves if that's how they feel like they can engage with the materials. There's choice and options of how you can demonstrate your learning, which speaks towards differentiated instruction and formative assessment strategies for teachers. So now, if you want to demonstrate that you have understood the concept of 2 + 2 more is 4, you can show me that by drawing 2 apples and then drawing 2 strawberries and coming out with 4 fruits. Or you can have 2 3D blocks, 2 more 3D blocks, and you can have a collection of 4. Or you could, if a child likes to deal with kinesthetic things, you can actually have paper, tear one strip, tear another strip, tear another strip, and then stop at the 4th strip. Or you could tell me with your words that if I hum 1 line and I hum 3 more, I have 4 lines in my song or poem. So the idea here is that the curriculum is flexible enough and which this is also a very defining and discerning feature. It's flexible enough for the teacher to have individual autonomy over how the children can engage with the material. And one of the guiding principles is that all of the learning should be student-centered, not necessarily teacher-directed. When you're doing something new, the hardest shift is a shift in your mind. When you want people to try something new, people are usually very risk averse, very change averse. So I think the first thing that we should do, need to do, are trying to do is change people's mindsets about what the teaching and learning experience is. To be frank, sometimes when we think about teaching, there's a lot of power and control that rests in that process. We have been conditioned to think that order and control is indicative of a strong teaching and learning environment. And it might sound like I'm going off on a tangent, but I'm really not. Because in a classroom where children are free to interact with each other, free to interact or voice an opinion, that is when you start to build collective understanding. That is when you start to build individual appreciation and understanding of what you're learning. And it creates a safe environment where even as you learn, you can challenge different things that you thought you knew and feel okay about that. So changing the mindset of teachers' approach to interacting with children is one of those things. Now, for a more nuts and bolts perspective, we, first of all, piloted this curriculum 2 years ago. I think we began in 2018. And that was in 112 schools across the country, in every single education district. And based on the results of that exercise, when we measured student-centered teaching practices for teachers, when we took the beginning measure, what we call our baseline, only about 6% of our teachers were teaching in a developmental, student-centered way. Before the onset of the pandemic, when we removed ourselves from face-to-face classrooms, that measure of student-centered teaching practices skyrocketed to 32%. This is when you know that training works. Because we trained those teachers, we developed a cadre of master trainers who would go and monitor in those spaces 3 times per term. And at every visit, we would set goals based on what we observed in the teaching and learning space. So it really brought frontally to those educators places where they themselves saw they could improve. And that, after the first visit, they're not necessarily expecting you to come back. And then you come back, they go, "Oh, miss, you came." And so now you've built that expectation of collaborative growth. And the teachers themselves started to make that mental and physical adjustment. So teacher training is important because we have now scaled up the curriculum to grades 1 through 4. We're doing a 2-phased approach. So as you would have seen in the ether, we have scaled up in all of the coastland regions. So that's regions, Education District 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, and District Georgetown. And in September, the coming academic year, we're going to scale up to grade 4 in the hinterland regions and also provide pointed training for private schools as well. So by the end of the academic year 2023-2024, the entire country in public and private sector education spaces, this is the kind of curriculum we're going to be working with. And I mean, that's a pretty exciting time. What we have changed is our approach to training. And this is anchored in the research. For teacher professional development to be strong, consistent, and enduring, You can't take a one and done approach. Historically, we would bring all our teachers out, we would train our soul cases out for 5 days, and then usher everybody back to their spaces. But at the first sign of resistance, what do? You kind of fall back into old habits because that's what you're used to. So at the first sign of challenge or cognitive or mental dissonance, you kind of default to your settings. But what we've done differently is every month, the master trainers deploy to their clusters of schools. And we started even before the academic year began, so that we could orient the teachers to what the shifts and changes are, help them to find themselves in the documents. And then even as school began, we maintained that contact so that even as they practice, they have a space to come with their questions, with their concerns, if they need additional strategies. And the master trainers themselves brought new information that would help them. So if you kind of think of it as a slow release model, instead of pelting all of the information at our teachers, we went incrementally so that they could have more time for uptake. It is so fundamentally important that we prepare our children to participate in the world that they live in. And it's no longer preparing them for 21st century life. They're living in the 21st century. So if we're being completely honest with ourselves, we're playing catch up. We want our children to be able to interface as good citizens to each other, but also to be good regional and global citizens. And part of that is being able to understand that the world isn't just black and white, that education is not who recalls the facts the best to write a test. It is about being able to debate intelligently. It's about being able to research. It's about being able to navigate the internet safely. It's being able to discern what is a sound resource and what is not, because the internet is so chock full of misinformation. It's also about how to synthesize and analyze and critically assess things for yourselves. And the terms I'm using might sound like high schoolers preparing for CAPE, but you can teach a 3-year-old how to critically examine something. It's just a matter of the developmental way in which you pitch your questions, in the types of resources that you present. And children are just naturally curious. You want to leverage that to increase their understanding. And I keep saying understanding instead of learning because understanding is the goal of education. Another great question. And I'm happy I have an answer for you. Now, part of sound teaching and learning is the time that the teacher also spends learning, because teachers are learners too. We have, thankfully, built into our education system professional development days that teachers are expected to have. So what we've done, for want of a better expression, is hijack those professional development days and use them for our training. So now, at least for the initial training period, teachers' professional development time is devoted to learning about the different aspects of the curriculum and different tools and elements that they would need to be successful at implementing the curriculum. After that initial training period is exhausted, the goal is that head teachers and school leaders, instructional leaders, would be able to continue to use their teacher professional development time to really hone in on school or classroom specific areas that they feel like they still need reinforcement for. And of course, we have Our master trainers is resource personnel. The subject specialists here at the agency is resource personnel. The regions have resource personnel. So they have, and they themselves are resource personnel, because if we are building strong communities of practice, then I may not know everything, but what I don't know, perhaps you do. And if we work shoulder to shoulder in the same school space, why not lean on my expertise? Now, the homeschool community triumvirate is what is necessary for sound education to actually take place. And we are so desirous of our parents and, well, our primary caregivers, because I mean, it's not only parents who are parenting, to really buy into what we're trying to do here. Don't be scared if your child does not come home with 50 pages of notes at the end of the school day, because they are still having rich educational experiences. In fact, for a lot of learners, that 50 pages of notes tends to frustrate your child. And it also removes the spirit of learning that is, developmentally appropriate and child-centered. We would also wish for our parents to become advocates or champions of creating literacy-rich environments in their homes. It doesn't mean that you need to be wealthy and buy the latest gadgets and have the most amount of books and things like that. It could simply mean take your child to the Learning Resource Center in your community. Take your child to the library. Read signs on the road as they walk. Find different ways to have discussions with your children about what they're learning. Because if the child can't tell you what they're learning, or more importantly, why they're learning it, ask your teacher, take your teacher to task. Because the children need to also know why they're learning what they're learning. So it opens the door for better teacher-parent communication when you understand that for learning to take place, you don't have to be copying down from a chalkboard all the time. It also means that expressions or demonstrations of learning don't always have to be about how many red stars or checks are in your book. It could also mean when I come into the classroom and I see my child's painting there, that might demonstrate their concept of half and whole, that they're showing their learning. It might be a photograph of my child working with other children to build a puzzle. That is a demonstration of learning. It might be listening to an audio file of my child reciting a poem. That is a demonstration of learning. It could be looking through my child's portfolio at parent-teacher conference time to see all of the different ways my child is demonstrating their learning. So it's not just learning in the old-time way, the way that you yourself went to school and did it. I mean, think about it. Guyana is just over 50 years old as a nation. Our parents, or even grandparents, because you guys are young, didn't have books in school to write. They had slates. It was like a mini chalkboard with chalk. And you took your slate to school. You didn't come home with books filled with notes because you had to erase your slate the next day. So I just want us to think about the fact that evidence of learning doesn't only happen in one way. And I think if our families understand that, we are also going to have a much better experience. And talk to your teacher. Every week, there's going to be something new and exciting. So have that discussion. What to expect? How can I help? Yeah. That is a beautiful question, because as you're going to learn in subsequent discussions, this curriculum is built on the principles of inclusivity. And when we think of inclusion, we generally think of children with physical disabilities or learners with behavioral challenges. But this curriculum looks at the needs of so many diverse learners, whether it's diversity of language, whether your child is gifted, whether your child has a disability or any kind of impairment or impediment. How does the curriculum address this? Right in the document of itself, we direct our teachers to a whole suite of inclusive learning strategies and inclusive assessment strategies. So it's right there in the document. These are strategies that straddle a range of learning styles, that straddle a range of accessibility. And I say that to say that if you have a child in your class who is potentially visually impaired, right there on the lesson plan, the teacher is expected to think about all of the learners in their class and use strategies that would promote learning for that child. And if you think about teaching and learning in that way, when you keep the most disadvantaged person at the back of your mind while you're planning, you will find that the strategies that you use, that the modes that you use, benefits all of your learners better. So you're going to find those two features, inclusive learning strategies and inclusive assessment strategies, built right into the curriculum document. If properly applied, this is a beautiful opportunity for us to refashion what we see as our ideal Guyanese citizen, because citizenship education it plays a very pivotal role in what we want the fabric of our society to look like. And that starts with what we do in the classroom. And if we want to have children, adults, because children are growing into that pathway, God so willing, who are literate, who are numerate, who are socially responsible, who are not technologically averse, these are the kinds of claims that we are making, that if this curriculum is properly applied, these are the adults that we can expect our children to become.